Andrew from Sachs. Does screen time hurt you? Well, you may be wondering why I'm even raising the question. In fact, if you look at previous videos, you'll even hear me talk about evidence that screen time hurts people. But in fact, recent indications are that the question is not quite as simple as we thought. Firstly, here's the case that screen time does hurt you. You see a bunch of studies here published in peer-reviewed journals. So they're dealing with issues such as mental health, they're dealing with issues such as cyberbullying, they're dealing with issues such as suicidal behaviours, talking about people being sedentary, talking about things like obsessive compulsive disorders, cardiometabolic disease. So if you look at that, that's a pretty scary list of things that go wrong when you spend time focusing on a screen. But in fact, other research is not quite so definitive on this, and there are real questions being raised now about whether people are being hurt by screen time. So here's a bunch of studies that suggest the alternatives, that maybe screen time doesn't hurt you, or if it does, it doesn't hurt you very badly. And in particular, the Auburn study there, which was a pretty significant study, a meta-analytical study where you go back and reanalyze data from a range of different studies. What Auburn discovered is that the effect size was only about 0.4 of 1%. In other words, 0.4 of 1% worse off based on screen time. Now, if you look at the rest of these, they will indicate, yes, there were significant differences in the outcomes of people who spent a lot of time on screens, but relatively mild or modest differences. That raises a bunch of interesting questions, and there are problems with the proposition that screen time hurts us. And the first is this question of, it's new, so it's bad. I don't know if you've heard of a fellow by the name of Socrates, but if you went back to ancient Greece, Socrates spoke out against a social ill, something that he felt would compromise the world of thinking and of intellectual endeavour, and what he was talking about was the written word. As the written word became widely accepted across civilization, Socrates genuinely believed that things were going to get worse intellectually. Well, turns out he wasn't quite right. Then, in the 1700s, a guy called J.S. Bach wrote a thing called the Coffee Cantata, and really it was all about the damage that would come to people from drinking coffee. And the same as goes back to novels. So when novels were first written, they were considered to be extremely damaging to the human intellect. So I think we've got to be careful about this, it's new, so it's bad. The second thing is that there are also studies citing the benefits of social media. So if you happen to have some nerdy, subculture-y kind of interest, well, how do you find people with those nerdy, subculture-y kind of interests other than social media? So if you're on screens, it may well buddy you up with people who like macrame or dog breeding or whatever your taste is. So there's an upside opportunity. Third, what is screen time? Is researching a term paper as damaging, or helpful for that matter, as doom scrolling TikTok? I reckon one of the biggest problems of these studies is that they just talk about screen time as though it's almost homogeneous. Yes, some will differentiate into social media screen time, but the bulk of them are really quite broad-minded about what constitutes screen time, and that would appear to be a methodological issue with many of these studies. But the biggest methodological issue, in my opinion, is the question of correlation versus causation. So the question of correlation versus causation is often raised in science. Because things correlate together, in other words, they go together mathematically, does that necessarily mean that one is causing the other? And so there have been a whole bunch of examples of this. I used to lecture in multivariate data analysis, and we used to talk about correlation and causation all the time. And so, do firefighters cause fires? Well, we would think logically not, but the correlation is there. When fires happen, firefighters are around a lot, and yes, if there's a causative direction, it's probably the fires causing the firefighters to turn up. But still in all, that's something that's kind of obvious, but other things are not so obvious. Another one is ice creams and fires. When ice cream consumption is higher, you get fires. Well, I don't think there's a causative link between the two. And in fact, the causative link is a third component, which is heat. When it's hot, people buy ice creams and they buy fizzy drinks, and they also tend to experience more fires. So the issue here is screen time damaging people's mental health? Or do people with poor mental health seek out screen time? And there is quite a bit of evidence that the latter might be more dominant than the former. So what that looks like is you have personality here. Personality is very heavily genetically determined. And so if a person is high in emotionality, what that will tend to mean is that they may well be the sort of people who have very strong emotions. They may lack resilience. They might find it difficult to put up with pressure or challenges in their life. Well, if you're like that, then it may well be that you're going to spend more time at home, and you might spend more time on social media or other forms of screen-based pastimes than somebody who is more confident, who might be more likely to go out of the house and risk the process of rejection, making friends, running into all the challenges associated with that. If you look at some other personality characteristics, you'll see extroversion and cheerfulness and optimism is part of that. Now, if a person happens to be lucky enough to be born cheerful and optimistic, and this is again a very strong genetic gift, well, maybe I'm the sort of person who is more likely to go out and do things. And we know that from a research point of view. People who are more optimistic and cheerful tend to take bigger risks in their lives. People who are sadder and more naturally introverted will tend to avoid those things. So which is causing which? Is it that we're really plugging into, in these big data samples, people who are naturally inclined to be a little bit less psychologically robust, and that's what's going on with them perhaps? Maybe that's what's causing them to seek out social media or other screen times, rather than social media or screen times damaging them. So these are characteristics that can be measured on the way into workplaces, and so if you're interested in understanding better how to use psychometric assessment in your workplace, perhaps you'd like to try a free psychometric assessment, use the QR code that you see on the screen now.